And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. Thanks for being with us. In the meantime here, I want to move on to some more of these top headlines. Before we get into some of the news coming out of the Middle East, just a programming alert for you for something that we had been previewing, a major launch by SpaceX. Well, we're learning that it was just scrubbed. So unfortunately, we won't have that live for you in the next hour. SpaceX telling us this, due to unfavorable weather at the launch site and an issue with one of the NASA spacecraft, we're standing down from tonight's Falcon 9 launch of NASA's Sphere-X and Punch missions. They say the next launch opportunity is tomorrow at 8:10 p.m. Pacific time here. If the launch conditions are favorable tomorrow, we will definitely bring you that. This was supposed to be SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket launching from the Vandenberg Space Force Base in California to take these missions to space, but scrubbed for the night. We'll see whether or not they can get this off the ground tomorrow. All right, in the meantime here, let's keep it moving with more of these top headlines, especially on the Israel-Hamas conflict. Fox News correspondent Alex Hogan with more from London.
The United States is committed to finishing this and seeing it all the way through, all hostages.
Officials from Qatar, Egypt, and the U.S. are meeting this week for negotiations in an effort to reach a second stage of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The first phase of the ceasefire ended last week. Israel is pressing Hamas to accept an extension of that first phase, looking for the militant group to release half of the remaining hostages in return for a promise to negotiate a lasting truce.
Israel's goals are by now well known: the return of all of our hostages, the elimination of the Hamas military and also their governmental capabilities, and the removal of the terrorist threat to our people.
Hamas, however, is looking toward the second phase, which would see the release of hostages, but also the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza.
A starter is Hamas demilitarizing, not rearming, leaving all their arms on the ground and leaving Gaza. That's the start.
Meanwhile, Palestinians in Gaza are desperate for a second stage of the ceasefire. On Sunday, Israel stopped the supply of electricity into Gaza 1 week after pausing shipments of aid, food, and medicine onto the Strip.
We want to live. We want to live. We are people looking to live, looking for life. Their people suffer just like us. Both nations are in pain.
Israel says it has sent a delegation to Qatar to continue negotiations in effort to reach a second stage of this ceasefire. In Tel Aviv, Israel, Alex Hogan, Fox News.
Alex, thanks so much. Let's talk about all of this even further with our friends there at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, including the analyst there, Aaron Goren. He joins me. Aaron, thanks for being with us here. And I have to ask, we were talking with some of your colleagues last week about all the rhetoric, very harsh language emanating from the Trump administration, conditions and demands being put on Hamas to release all the hostages here. A weekend has gone by and no fruit has been born from some of that harsh language here. But it does seem like the parties are getting back to the table. Is that because of Israel's actions, cutting off aid into Gaza, cutting off electricity into the enclave over the weekend? Do you attribute it to that?
Well, that's certainly part of it. And first of all, thank you for having me on, Andrew. I think what we're seeing right now is the exhaustion of all negotiating options alongside with this sort of step-by-step military escalation. So first you have the withholding of aid into the Strip and now the withholding of electricity, which realistically isn't going to affect much. But if the talks continue to stall, we're going to see that sort of military pressure continue to ramp up from Israel. That's going to continue.
So, Aaron, I think a lot of people wondering and watching might be asking themselves, why does Israel control Gaza's electricity supply?
Yeah, so realistically, they don't control. So they sell it to the Palestinian Authority. It's not really controlled by Israel. And even this cutoff, most Gazans are living on diesel generators. So this goes to one desalination plant, which is going to turn salt water into drinkable water. Yeah. Realistically, this won't be the step that sort of, applies the most military pressure. It's what comes next. It's whether or not the IDF will now restart airstrikes, these mass evacuation orders, and sort of restart this military campaign. So I think that's what we're going to look for in the next coming week.
That's so interesting because essentially phase one has been over for more than a week. And you can make the argument that the ceasefire is no longer in place because phase two has not been agreed upon or negotiated, and yet no fighting in that interim. Are you surprised by that? So you can kind of say the ceasefire is holding, but it's not really. Help me explain that.
Right. So the phase one of the ceasefire, which was this sort of Palestinian prisoner exchange and a complete an Israeli withdrawal from the Netzarim corridor, and then the release of hostages in those sort of barbaric ceremonies that we've seen with hostages like Eli Sharabi, who come out looking like Holocaust survivors. That was phase one, and that expired on March 1st, so the end of March 1st. What we're in now is this sort of limbo period. It's a de facto ceasefire because other than the IDF responding to immediate threats to its troops, where it still has troops in the Gaza Strip, there is no fighting, like you said. So Hamas is essentially getting a de facto ceasefire continuation while not releasing any more hostages. So that's why you're going to see these negotiations within the next few days in Doha. And who knows what's going to happen from there. If those don't work out, you could see a resumption of military activities. I don't see it being a sort of immediate happening because it takes time to mobilize these troops. Sure. But you could see that happening should these talks in Doha this week fail.
Okay, I want to talk about the politics underpinning the talks themselves. I want to put this tweet up here from, I believe, a Reuters reporter. So Secretary Rubio, on his way to Saudi Arabia, spoke to reporters on the plane to Jeddah, saying that U.S. hostage envoy Adam Boehler's direct meeting with Hamas was a, quote, one-off situation. And as of now, it hasn't borne fruit. He added that the primary vehicle for Gaza hostage talks will continue to be via Steve Witkoff, another special envoy here. Aaron, what is going on? Who is Adam Boehler? Did he go rogue? Who told him to speak directly to Hamas? Because apparently, and we reported this last week, that the Israelis gave their blessing, and yet over the weekend, the Israelis weren't even told about these direct talks between Boehler and Hamas here. Help us make this make sense. Why did he do this without Israel's blessing? And if it didn't bear fruit, like Secretary Rubio said, was it all for naught?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is separate strategies, and there's sort of a multitude of strategies going on from both the United States and Israel. In this case, what Boehler did was break a decades-old mantra and negotiate with terrorists. And I think we could have said ahead of time it wasn't going to work out. They reportedly offered 5 to 10 years of a ceasefire in exchange for the hostages. And I guess this was immediately rejected by Hamas. So those talks didn't bear fruit. And I think Secretary Rubio now sees that this should just be a one-off. And this shouldn't be the strategy going forward because it's not going to yield results. What is going to yield results is pressure on Hamas to release the hostages or else, which is what President Trump has been pushing rhetorically.
What's so interesting is we've been talking to folks like yourself, analysts, ever since President Trump was sworn in about some of these new, novel, creative, unorthodox approaches to diplomacy. And the U.S. In direct negotiations and talks with Hamas, with a foreign terror organization, which they haven't been in direct talks with, I believe, since 1997. I read that correctly. That is part of the novelty here. And to your point, though, if it doesn't bear anything, if it doesn't work, is it still worth pursuing those creative avenues, diplomatically speaking here?
Well, I would say try all options, and that's sort of what's going on is we're exhausting those negotiating options because there's still 5 Americans left, 4 of which are believed to be dead, and then one named Eden Alexander, who's believed to be alive. So what the Trump administration seems to be doing here is trying every single strategy possible to diplomatically negotiate their release, especially the Americans, because it's in America's interest to release American hostages, as President Trump has made clear. But today they kind of said, Steve Witkoff in that interview said, a prerequisite for moving on in negotiations is a disarmament of Hamas. And that's where we hit this impasse, because both Israel and now the U.S. with Witkoff's statements are saying we cannot move forward into phase 2, which Hamas wants to do, without Hamas committing to a complete disarmament and even leaving the Gaza Strip, which is what Steve Witkoff said today.
But doesn't, negotiating with Hamas, putting security guarantees for Hamas on the table, for Hamas to live another day if the fighting stops, if they release the hostages here, doesn't that undercut Israel's position? And should we be doing that? I mean, who are we, who is the United States, to be doing this without Israel's say?
Well, it depends if they were negotiating for the release of all hostages or if they were negotiating for the American citizens and the bodies of American citizens held by Hamas, because those are two different things. I do think it's counterproductive to negotiate with terrorists by principle. These are Islamist terrorist organizations who aren't going to agree to disarm. It's not in their nature. And Hamas, through every conflict in 2008 and 2014, since they've held power in the Gaza Strip, has always gotten a ceasefire and a live another day deal. And that's what they're seeking to get based off that historic precedent. Steve Witkoff has made it clear that they're not going to get it that time.
Okay, I'm only pushing on this, for the sake of argument, because I think it's, interesting politically speaking, because if you're Special Envoy Bowler and you're speaking with Hamas directly, after your boss, President Trump, last week said there will be all hell to pay with Hamas if they don't release every living and dead hostage here. Doesn't it undercut that message that Trump is displaying for his U.S. envoy to speak with them directly? Does it tamper down the harsh rhetoric in, say, a Truth Social post?
It tampers it down only so far as you don't act upon those words after the inevitable happens and after it fails, which it did. And Secretary Rubio came out today and said those direct talks failed. And by the way, those happened weeks ago. So those are in the past. Secretary Rubio assured the American people and the Israeli people that that was a one-off strategy that has now been exhausted, and we can move on from there, perhaps making good on some of the harsher rhetoric that President Trump has been posting on Truth.
Aaron, just lastly, where are you looking in this conflict going forward?
Well, unfortunately, it seems like we are at an impasse with an Iranian-backed terrorist organization that is not putting down its arms. It's not going to release its only leverage left, which is these hostages. And Israel is essentially promising its southern residents and all residents that it will never let a terrorist organization like Hamas build up its capabilities right next to their communities again. So we're at an impasse, which normally may spell a return to hostilities and fighting in the Gaza Strip. Because if Israel is serious about what they say they're serious about, which is the eradication of Hamas, and that doesn't happen through a voluntary surrender and disarmament, then we're going to have to return to fighting. Israel's going to have to go back into the Gaza Strip and do it militarily.
All right. Aaron Goren there with the FDD. Aaron, thanks for your time and your insight tonight. We'll talk soon.